It's an action-packed edition of News Point today. The stage is set this time in Japan's Hiroshima. The first session of the three-day G7 summit has begun with a working lunch session. What's expected to dominate the agenda is the Russia-Ukraine war and China's so-called coercive economic politics. G7 leaders Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak, Justin Trudeau, Olaf Scholz, Giorgia Meloni, Fumio Kishida and Emmanuel Macron held bilateral talks on Thursday evening and on Friday morning. Before the first session of the summit began, the G7 leaders visited the Hiroshima Peace Memorial and paid their respects to the victims of the atomic bomb tragedy of 1945. The leaders were met by Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida at the memorial, also called the Atomic Bomb Dome. The G7 leaders also planted trees in the Hiroshima Peace Park. Let's just take a look at the bilaterals that have taken place so far as well. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida held talks with his Italian counterpart Giorgia Meloni ahead of the start of the G7 Leaders Summit. Kishida also held delegation-level talks with French President Emmanuel Macron, who arrived in Hiroshima on Friday morning. Fumio Kishida and US President Joe Biden held bilateral talks ahead of the summit as well. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and, of course, Japanese counterpart Fumio Kishida announced the signing of the Hiroshima Accords ahead of the opening day of the summit. This includes a semiconductor supply chain amid an increasingly competitive market.
今日も日との間において日英関係をより進展させるための有益な議論を行い、そして日英広島アコードを発出することによって両国の幅広い協力を示したいと思っています。
Britain has unveiled new sanctions against Russia's minerals sector, targeting imports of diamonds as well as aluminum, copper and nickel in a bid to choke Moscow's ability to fund the war in Ukraine. Britain is also targeting an additional 86 people and companies from Putin's military-industrial complex. European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen also arrived in Hiroshima on Thursday. European Council President Charles Michel has said that the G7 bloc will target the lucrative trade in Russian diamonds as part of a renewed push to hamper Moscow's war effort. Ahead of the G7, the United States revealed that they will impose new significant sanctions targeting Russia's war machine. As per a US official, the G7 bloc wants to disrupt Russia's war supplies, close evasion loopholes and further reduce reliance on Russian energy. On a historic occasion, Brazilian President Lula also arrived in Hiroshima mere hours ago. Brazil it's been invited to the G7 meeting after a long interval of 14 years here. The other big thing to look out for, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is on a three-nation visit of Japan, Papua New Guinea and Australia. Japan, of course, as you know, is hosting the G7 summit. The forum members include France, United States, UK, Germany, Japan, Italy and Canada. The EU, it's a non-enumerated member here. Before visiting Australia, the Indian Prime Minister will attend a summit of the Forum for India-Pacific Islands Cooperation in Papua New Guinea. Here's more on the Prime Minister's packed schedule here. In 6 days, the Indian Prime Minister will visit 3 nations, about 40 engagements that have been lined up here and meetings with over 24 leaders. The Indian Prime Minister will arrive in Japan later today. The G7 summit in Hiroshima, a city which has recovered from the catastrophic damage by an atomic bomb and which continues to seek lasting world peace. During the summit, the Indian Prime Minister will speak at G7 with partner countries on subjects such as peace, stability, prosperity and sustainable development. Food, fertilizer, energy security, health, also major issues on the agenda here. Prime Minister Modi will also speak on other issues of global importance, of course, such as gender equality, climate change and environment. Resilient infrastructure, development cooperation. Remember, this visit to Japan includes bilateral meetings with Fumio Kishida and other G7 leaders. The Indian Prime Minister will then travel to Papua New Guinea. He will host the 3rd summit of the Forum for Indo-Pacific Islands Cooperation, jointly with Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea on the 22nd of May. Launched in 2014, the forum involves India and 14 Pacific Island countries, and this will be the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Papua New Guinea. Now, after that, the Indian Prime Minister will visit Australia from the 22nd to the 24th of May. He will hold a bilateral meeting with Anthony Albanese, meet CEOs, business leaders, interact with the Indian diaspora in Australia here. So, of course, as you know, the G7 Leaders Summit is underway in Hiroshima. The high-powered G7 summit has kicked off. The first session, the working lunch session, is currently underway. Prime Minister Narendra Modi too has embarked on a very crucial three-nation visit with about 40 engagements that have been lined up over the course of the next 6 days. Now, in 6 days, the Indian Prime Minister will visit 3 nations, as I mentioned, about 40 engagements lined up, and also meetings with over 24 leaders here. The Indian Prime Minister will be in Japan today, will speak with the G7 leaders on important issues such as peace, sustainable development, energy, security, food security as well. The Indian Prime Minister will then go to Papua New Guinea and then to Australia. Now, for more on this, we are being joined by our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, live from Hiroshima. Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us. Crucial day at the G7 summit. Talks aside, do you think we can expect any breakthroughs when it comes to the war in Ukraine?
Well, there's a lot of audio around me where I'm standing right now. I'm just standing outside the International Media Center, where, of course, the culture of Hiroshima is being shown. But the focus, of course, at this year's G7 summit has been the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Chinese aggressive actions. And in past few hours, the biggest development has been the fact that reports indicate that the Ukrainian President Zelensky is expected to travel to G7. If this happens, there is no confirmation from Zelensky's office so far, but if it happens, it will be a significant development at a time when Japan itself has been reaching out to Ukraine as the chair of the G7, and the G7 is expected to announce a series of sanctions against Russia, the Russian government, and President Putin. As you were pointing out, that how UK has essentially banned Russian diamonds. So we could expect more such developments in past few days when it comes to the G7 grouping. In fact, the joint statement is something that will be carefully read, given the fact that this will be a pretty strong statement against Russia that will be released on Sunday.
Right, Siddhant. Of course, as I mentioned earlier as well, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is also on a very crucial three-nation visit, Japan being the first stop here. The Indian Prime Minister will speak at G7 sessions with partner countries, as I mentioned. We know that India, it's so far pushed for dialogue and diplomacy when it comes to the war in Ukraine. What can you tell us of India's role at the G7?
Well, regarding the Indian Prime Minister's visit, we know that he has been to Japan several times in the past, but this time he is being invited for G7. Now, Japan is India's close friend, and an invitation from Tokyo was no surprise. But the fact that India is participating not only as an invited country, but also as a country which is the chair of the G20. Now, India hosts the summit in September, and during this G7 summit, the Indian Prime Minister will get opportunity to engage with many of those countries who will be going to the summit in New Delhi. He has 5 bilaterals so far which have been confirmed, which includes with the UK Prime Minister on Sunday, and on Saturday he will be meeting the French President, leaders from Vietnam, South Korea, and of course the Japanese Prime Minister, who's the host of this entire meeting. But essentially it will be a packed visit for the Indian Prime Minister, given that there will be the hard diplomacy aspect, but also the aspect which might be termed as the soft diplomacy, but furthering of India. We know that the Indian Prime Minister will be inaugurating a bust of Mahatma Gandhi here in Hiroshima, the city that was devastated by the atomic bomb in 1945. So there is this peace link that the Indian side is trying to establish.
All right, Siddhant, another major point here, as per some reports, Ukrainian President Zelensky may also visit Japan. What can you tell us about that, and what sort of message do you think it would put out, a potential visit by Zelensky?
Well, there's a lot of audio around me, so it's very difficult to right now hear your question. But I can only talk about the previous question, that the Indian Prime Minister's visit and what kind of engagement he's looking here at the G7 summit. Approximately the engagements, if we talk about 3-country visit, there are 40 engagements, but substantial part of his engagement will be here at the G7, where he meets the leaders from the various groupings, because the summit, the outreach summit for the invited countries, takes place on Sunday. The focus, of course, today and tomorrow will be the G7 summit. Now, 8 countries have been invited by the host, that's Japan, which includes India, Australia, countries like South Korea, Indonesia, Vietnam and Brazil. So the focus from the Japanese side is also the Indo-Pacific. So of the 8 countries that have been invited, 5 are from the Indo-Pacific region. That shows that how Japan is keen to show itself as an alternative to China in the region and beyond as well.
Right, Siddhant, I believe you couldn't hear my question earlier. What I was asking is that, as per some reports, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky may also make a visit to Japan. What sort of a message do you think a potential visit by him would put out?
Well, yes, according to reports, it looks like President Zelensky will be present in person here in Japan. Now, that will be seen as a significant development. There hasn't been any confirmation either by the Japanese side or the Ukrainian side. We reached out to the Japanese side as well. But any visit in person by the Ukrainian president will be an important symbolic move by the Ukrainian side. First, of course, Hiroshima, of course, is symbolic itself. But the fact that the G7 is expected to announce series of sanctions against the Russian government is something that the Ukrainian side will be keen on. It's given now that there will be a strong statement by the G7 countries. Already countries like the UK have announced sanctions against the Russian diamond. So President Zelensky will be more than happy to be present here. We know that earlier this year the Japanese Prime Minister was in Kyiv. In fact, he visited Kyiv from New Delhi, and of course in Kyiv he invited President Zelensky to attend the G7 summit. So last year we know that President Zelensky was present at the G7 summit, but that was virtually when the host was Germany. Now this time, of course, he travels to Japan, and perhaps this is his first visit to Asia as well. He has been traveling a lot in last few weeks, but largely the visit has been confined to the Western countries. So this will be a significant move outside of Europe and America.
Right. Well, Siddhant, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on this. We will, of course, continue to track the developments closely. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.